I get to do the next, whoops, excuse me. Sorry, I forgot to share the screen. I'm doing the next two segments, and I promise that together they'll be no more than 20 minutes. The first one may be longer than 10, but then the second one will be shorter than 10. My topic is the meaning of love in the Judeo-Christian tradition. Here's love in the Judeo-Christian tradition. It's from the book of Leviticus in what Christians call the Old Testament, the Jewish Bible, the Tanakh, chapter 19, verse 18, the second part of verse 18. That's what the B is about. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. This is the second great commandment according to Jesus. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Leviticus was composed probably about 600 years before Jesus, 600 BC. I'd like to go back further to the beginning of Israelite religion. So I'd like to go back to 1200 BC. That's when the Israelite people first appear in the archaeological record. They appear in tiny villages on hilltops in central Canaan. And by Canaan, I mean a geographical area. We call it Palestine today. Tiny villages. I'll show you a picture of one. This is a view from the air of a village called Ai. AI here doesn't mean artificial intelligence. It's the name of a village. They're just ruins there now, but no one has lived there for 1,000 years. But in 1200 BC or so, a new people settled this hilltop and constructed a village, and archaeologists say they were the original Israelites. Why were they up in the hills? Well, because they could get away from the kings and their armies who controlled the fertile valleys in Canaan. They were up there for freedom. It was hard to make a living up there, though. The soil was thin. The rain only came during the rainy season, which was mostly the winter and early spring. Then the sun just came out and baked for 8 months. The rains, when they were heavy, tended to wash the soil down the hillsides. There's no springs up there. There are no ponds, of course, or brooks. They had to build cisterns, underground water tanks, to conserve the water that came during the rainy season. They had to terrace the hillsides, that is, transform the hillsides into shelves, basically, so they could grow their crops. Now, both the building of the cisterns and the construction and maintenance of the terraces required a lot of labor, but there were only 150 people so in this village, and maybe only 40 people with the youth and vigor to do this kind of hard work. They raised sheep for wool mostly, but occasionally meat. They raised goats for milk and yogurt and cheese. And they grew grapes and figs and dates and a few other crops, but mostly grapes and figs and dates because these things could be stored and get them through the winter. If you find this at all interesting, there's a book called Who Were the Early Israelites and Where Did They Come From?, whose title I put there at the bottom. William Dever was a biblical scholar and an archaeologist who wrote some just wonderful books on the beginnings of ancient Israel. In the book of Exodus today, there is a very old law code. The biblical scholars call it the covenant code, and it's more than one chapter of Exodus. It's a list of very particular laws. These laws are older than the Ten Commandments, which are kind of general principles that were extracted from these particular laws later. And I'd like to focus on this particular one. When you come upon your enemy's ox or donkey going astray, you shall bring it back. I'm going to assume that everybody's a man here because these societies were patriarchal, and even though, of course, women had a lot of influence behind the scenes. Explicitly, it's all men. Suppose you're a man, you're a farmer in one of these tiny villages. You're on the edge of ecological disaster. The village is tiny. People need to cooperate. It's just absolutely necessary for there to be cooperation, or the material welfare of the village itself is put in great danger. You see one of your enemy's draft animals, either his ox or his donkey, and it's wandering off, and your enemy, this is a guy that has probably bawled out one of your children in a way that you thought was inappropriate, or he's looked at your wife in a way that you don't like, or you don't think he's pulling his weight, or you think he's maybe been dishonest with you. You hate this guy. He's your enemy. You don't trust him. You don't like him. You have this opportunity to take revenge on him by just letting his draft animal go astray. But see, that would harm the whole community. The community is so dependent on everyone pulling their weight. This is to endanger the community. So you don't do that. You follow this law. You go to the trouble to chase the animal down and bring it back to your enemy's homestead. What does this have to do with love? Well, before I showed you the love command in Leviticus, but it's only the second part of a verse. Here's the whole verse. This is Leviticus 19:18. You shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against any of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. In many parts of the Bible, the same idea is expressed twice in succession in different words, and I believe this is a case of that. People didn't read Scripture then. There were very few copies of Scripture, and most people couldn't read. People heard Scripture read aloud to them. And so if you're hearing something, if you miss a word or a phrase or somebody coughs at the same time, you can't go back and reread it, or you can't replay that part of the tape, right? There's no recording. So in recognition of this, in important parts of Scripture especially, the same thought, the same concept was expressed twice to give people a chance to get it. And I believe this is a case of that. I believe that any of your people there in the first part is to be understood as meaning exactly the same thing as your neighbor in the second part. And I believe that you shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge in the first part is to be understood to mean you shall love as yourself in the second part. I think this is the core meaning of love in the Judeo-Christian tradition. If I'm right, that means that this peculiar little law about bringing your enemy's ox back, this is saying love your enemy. People say that love your enemy is an original expression with Jesus. I don't think so. I think the concept is here. You come upon your enemy's ox or donkey going astray, but you're not going to seek vengeance on this person. You're going to bring it back. This is loving your enemy. This is loving your enemy. I was interested in Matthew referring just a minute ago to Martin Luther King's expression that love means, in part, an absence of internal violence of the spirit. In other words, an absence of taking vengeance or bearing a grudge. Bearing a grudge, taking vengeance is the external violence, but bearing a grudge is the internal. Okay, that's here. That's here. So, that's what I have to say about the meaning of love in the Judeo-Christian tradition. What does that have to do with open discussion and honest sharing? Just a minute when I can get these little things to get out of my way. There, I can stop sharing. In those little villages, everybody was in the same boat, and more, of course, we realize that's true for all of humanity. I think this ethic applies 100% today. In one of those little villages, you had to allow your enemy to speak when there was a village gathering, which of course would have meant a gathering of the men, though the men would have been given instructions behind the scenes by the women, I'm sure. When there was a village gathering, you couldn't take any step to prevent your enemy from speaking, because your enemy, no matter how obnoxious this guy is, he may have an idea on a way of repairing a cistern by which the repair will last longer than the way cisterns have been repaired. Or he may have an improved idea on repairing or constructing one of these terraces. If you don't allow your enemy to speak, you're just being stupid. You're putting the whole community in danger. And I think that's what UU national officials are doing when they censor free speech in our denomination, which they've been doing right and left now for several years, more and more intensively. They're putting the whole Unitarian Universalist community in danger. Doing what they're doing is just stupid. Stupid in the sense of counterproductive, self-damaging. It's just stupid. And then I also talked about in my topic here, my second topic, the value of honest sharing. Now I'm thinking of community in a different sense. I'm thinking of the UU Ministers Association. I am a member of the UU Ministers Association, a member in good standing, and I attend chapter meetings. It kind of stuns me that I'm still a member in good standing, but I am. And the UU Ministers Association, besides being a kind of ministers' union, used to emphasize primarily education when there were meetings. The important point was to educate ministers in about something, some issue, some theological approach, whatever. Education. Melissa Carville-Zemer, who's the basically executive director of the UU Ministers Association, at a chapter meeting at which I was in attendance, said that the leaders now have decided to de-emphasize education and emphasize instead community. The Ministers Association is supposed to be a community, a supportive, loving community of colleagues. And I said to her in the question and answer period at the end, Melissa, if I'm going to be a member of a community in this sense, I have to be able to be honest with my colleagues. I have to tell them what I really think and what I really feel. But I can't do that. I'm afraid, Melissa. I'm afraid of you. I'm afraid of what the National Board of Directors will do. I can't, this is destructive of community. And she didn't answer the question, and she ended the question and answer period and ended the meeting. So ended her participation in the meeting. So that was that. But I want to tell you, that's what it feels like to attend a UU chapter meeting. It feels like East Germany before the fall of communism. In East Germany before the fall of communism, there was a secret police called Stasi, S-T-A-A-S-I. I don't know what that stands for, but I know that's the acronym. And Stasi had hundreds of thousands of informants. And in any group, if you were in a group of more than 3 or 4 people, and even then they had to be 3 or 4 people that you knew very well, if you were in any group of people larger than that, a group of 12 or 20 or 25 people, a group about the size of a minister's chapter meeting, you really had to watch what you said, because there was a significant chance that someone in the room was an informer for the secret police. And that's what UU ministers' meetings are like today. And this is nuts. This is nuts. For this kind of community, you need honest sharing, sharing of thoughts, sharing of feelings. And that's what I had to say. That's what I have to say on my second. And so we're up to the third and final before we have conversation. Um, there's one more thing on the agenda, and it was that Beverly Cease was going to read some excerpts from a famous speech by Frederick Douglass. I don't think Beverly Cease is here, though. So I think you're going to wind up having to listen to me some more. I'll read it instead. You've heard this before if you attend our third Wednesday services, but it's just lovely. We have a civil rights hero, maybe our greatest civil rights hero. He and King are one and two anyway. Let's put it that way. I don't know who's one or who's two. Frederick Douglass, an escaped slave, speaking at the Music Hall in Boston on December 9th, 1860. He escaped slavery at age 20. He's now 42 years old. He's now living in Rochester. He's the publisher of his own newspaper, the North Star. He's very well respected in anti-slavery circles. And this is not his whole speech, but just a few excerpts from it. And I think nothing could be more appropriate than that we're discussing freedom of speech. This is a black man talking, and talking in Boston, the headquarters of the UUA and the UUMA. So here's Frederick Douglass, right on the eve of the Civil War. He said, "We thought the principle of free speech was an accomplished fact. Here in Boston, if nowhere else, we thought that the right of the people to assemble and to express their opinion was secure. Dr. Channing," meaning William Ellery Channing, the Unitarian minister, "had defended the right. Mr. Garrison had," meaning William Lloyd Garrison, the head of the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society. "They had asserted the right, and Reverend Theodore Parker had maintained it with steadiness and fidelity to the last." And the reference to the last means that Theodore Parker had died about 6 months earlier. "But here we are today contending for what we thought we gained years ago. Last Monday, a meeting assembled to discuss the question, how shall slavery be abolished? The world knows that that meeting was invaded, insulted, captured by a mob of gentlemen, and thereafter broken up and dispersed by the order of the mayor, who refused to protect the meeting, though called upon to do so. The leaders of the mob were gentlemen. They were men who pride themselves upon their respect for law and order. These gentlemen brought their respect for law and order with them and proclaimed it loudly while in the very act of breaking the law. Theirs was the law of slavery, the law of free speech, and the law for the protection of public meetings they trampled underfoot, while they greatly magnified the law of slavery. No right was deemed by the fathers of our government more sacred than the right of speech. It was in their eyes, as in the eyes of all thoughtful men, the great moral renovator of society and government." I love that phrase, the great moral renovator of society. Daniel Webster, referring to the one-time congressman from New Hampshire and then senator from Massachusetts, Daniel Webster called it a homebred right, a fireside privilege. Liberty is meaningless where the right to utter one's thoughts and opinions has ceased to exist. That of all rights is the dread of tyrants. It is the right which they first of all strike down. They know its power. We are told that the meeting I referred to was ill-timed and the parties to it unwise. Has Boston yet to learn that the time to assert a right is the time when the right itself is called in question, and that those men of all others to assert it are the men to whom the right has been denied? There can be no right of speech where any man, however lifted up or however humble, however young or however old, is overawed by force and compelled to suppress his honest sentiments. Equally clear is the right to hear. To suppress free speech is a double wrong. It violates the rights of the hearer, as well as those of the speaker. It is just as criminal to rob a man of his right to speak and hear as it would be to rob him of his money. I have no doubt that Boston will vindicate this right, but in order to do so, there must be no concessions to the enemy. When a man is allowed to speak because he is rich and powerful, it aggravates the crime of denying the right to the poor and humble. The principle must rest upon its own proper basis, and until the right is accorded to the humblest as freely as to the most exalted citizen, the government of Boston is but an empty name and its freedom a mockery. A man's right to speak does not depend upon where he is born or upon his color. The simple quality of manhood is the solid basis for the right, and there let it rest forever. And with that, that's the end of our program. And now, if folks would like to talk, that's what the remaining time is for. We've scheduled at least another 40 minutes for talking, but if talking needs to continue beyond that, we can extend the meeting beyond that. So I'd like those of you who have things to say to please make use of this raise hand feature that's at the bottom of the screen. Sometimes there's no feature that actually says raised hand. Sometimes there's a feature that says responses, but if you click on that, you get raised hand. And it puts a little yellow hand in your window and brings your window to the very front, so I can call on you